Welcome to another episode of Raising OKC Kids, Conversations with Metro Family in Oklahoma City. I'm Kirsten Holder, and today we're talking about Diabetes Awareness Month with Senator Carri Hicks, a mother of three who also advocates for all Oklahoma's children in the state Senate and currently represents District 40. Little fun fact, she was also a 2021 Awesome Mom finalist for Metro Family Magazine, nominated by fellow Senator Julia Kurt. Senator Hicks, we are so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'm really excited to speak with you all today.
Yes, so a little bit of introduction. You were formerly a public educator and elected in 2018. Since that time, Senator Hicks has championed safety for babies and children in many common areas of concern, including public education, seatbelt safety, stronger laws protecting breastfeeding, and better health access for all, especially Oklahomans who have few healthcare options. An area that's especially close to Senator Hicks's heart includes advocacy and solutions for individuals with diabetes to get the appropriate and affordable care that they need. She is currently the chair for the Diabetes Caucus and has actually initiated much of this work from her personal experience as a mom. Her 7-year-old son, Sawyer, has type 1 diabetes. Aside from her work, Senator Hicks lives in Oklahoma City with her husband of 10 years, Spencer, and they are the proud parents of 3 children. So just jumping right in, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your son, Sawyer. So how did you know that he had type 1 diabetes? What did his diagnosis look like? And what is it like to parent a child with diabetes?
Sure. So this time of year is always a little sentimental for our family because it was actually around Halloween when we started noticing some different behavior with our son. So he was 17 months old at the time, and we just started to notice that his disposition was changing. He's naturally just a fun, bubbly personality, and he was starting to become a little cranky and grouchy. At the time, it seemed that he was cutting his molars. And so we assumed that much of that change was due to the discomfort that he was experiencing with molars. He ended up getting sick and had kind of flu-like symptoms. And so, it was basically explained away as potentially some kind of a virus that he had contracted, but it just continued to persist. And so, I think with anything, parents are constantly trying to figure out, okay, it's been more than 10 days. Is there something else that's going on with my child? So we noticed now what we know are all the symptoms associated with his diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. He was losing weight. He'd become lethargic. He was vomiting frequently, and that was because he was experiencing what's called diabetic ketoacidosis. So we were actually hospitalized and later found out that he was within about 30 minutes of losing his life. So our story was pretty terrifying, very scary in that, our family doesn't have any history of type 1 diabetes. And so we were unfamiliar with what was happening to our son. We were able to, get him on some fluids since he was severely dehydrated at the time of diagnosis. But then we weren't out of the woods yet because since his blood sugars were so elevated, there was a risk of brain damage in bringing him down to regular levels because of swelling. So we spent about 4 days in the pediatric ICU unit here in Oklahoma City at Deaconess at Baptist Hospital. And, we had a fantastic care team that really walked us through relearning how to keep our kiddo alive. I was pregnant at the time with our second, so we had our gender reveal in the ICU. But you just with anything, we just listened to the experts, tried to understand exactly what we needed to do moving forward. And thankfully, it's a team effort. So my husband's very involved in our care treatment. We both lead very active lifestyles, both with work and in our personal lives. And so it's just really important that we kind of tackle this as a team. And so, now as a parent to a type 1, as you said, he's 7, so he's thriving. We're really, really fortunate to have some really great cutting edge technology that helps us keep him within range. But, it is still just kind of an ongoing concern, especially around the holidays, because there's so many homemade meals that we're not quite sure what the carb count is, or being able to accurately dose him for his insulin, since he is still so small. Insulin can be fatal if it's given in the wrong dosage. So we are very active in making sure that he's maintaining his appropriate levels, but the school has been a really great partner. So we have a nurse on site at his elementary school who is amazing at communication. And so it really just, for us, we've decided not to have his blood sugar levels on any of our devices, because we want to train and trust the individuals that he's with. And that's working for our family. So we're really thankful to have, a nurse there who understands kind of our family dynamic, and is just an invaluable part of our treatment plan.
Wow. I cannot imagine having a little child, especially as young as he was, in the situation you all were in. That must have been terribly, terribly horrifying. And especially being pregnant, there's a lot of emotions going on anyway when it's your own baby, but then, the cocktail of emotions that come with pregnancy on top of that. I'm so glad to hear he's doing better. So from what I understand, children are more likely to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 is classified as an autoimmune disease, and genetics play a part. Type 2 diabetes occurs more commonly in adults, but type 2 diabetes in children is actually on the rise as well, fueled by the obesity epidemic. What are some other types? What are some of the differences, between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? And are there any other forms of diabetes we should know about?
Sure. So type 1 is an autoimmune disorder. So ultimately, his body just decided to attack his pancreas. So the beta cells are what produces insulin in the body. And since this autoimmune disorder attacks the beta cells, which means that they're unable to produce any insulin for themselves, insulin is like the magic key. It unlocks the cell so that the nutrients can cross into the cell and feed the body. And so without insulin, you cannot live, you cannot survive. So with type 1, it's ongoing insulin injections basically anytime you're eating in order for those nutrients to reach the cell. They have to administer insulin in some form. With type 2, it's really what's considered a rejection of insulin. So your body is still producing it, but there's a resistance for that insulin to work. And so there's different forms of treatment. Some of them are the same with type 2 diabetes, but especially if you're pre-diabetic, you can actually, prevent that diagnosis by a healthier or active lifestyle, making sure that you're eating, leafy green vegetables and all the good things in the proper amounts that have great nutrients to feed your body, and making sure that you're physically active. And so, with type 2 diabetes, the goal is that you could actually reverse that diagnosis through proper diet and exercise. In type 1, that's not possible unless your body just started producing beta cells and insulin on its own. And so there is gestational diabetes as well. And so that can occur during pregnancy. It can lead to either type 1 or type 2 after the baby's born. But through gestational diabetes, obviously it's the same course of treatment for type 2, and just making sure that you're staying away from certain foods that could trigger a negative reaction, and making sure that you're really eating some great quality foods that would be good for yourself and for the baby.
Yes, yes. So many things to consider when you're pregnant, like we just said, but especially for the health and longevity of your own family. And as you mentioned, you don't even have a history of type 1 diabetes in your own family. So I'm sure your diagnosis for your son was a little bit blindsiding in that regard.
Yeah. And I mean, what we've learned now is that it actually, it does take both parents somehow having a genetic composition that would lead to the diagnosis.
Mhm.
My husband and I have both now since been tested for those markers. and neither one of us carry them. But we basically, again, we just see ourselves as partners, and as a team in raising our kiddos. And so, thankfully, there's no blame game. It's not my family or his family. It's just the set of circumstances that we were handed. And we really, our goal is to just advocate and make sure that parents and families understand the risks and know what to look for in case this was a diagnosis that their family receives at some point.
Absolutely. So you mentioned some of the telltale symptoms that you noticed with your son, the lethargy, the flu symptoms, dehydration later on. Are there any other telltale symptoms, and are they similar between type 1 and type 2?
Yes. With type 2, it's a little bit tricky because you could basically be living with type 2 diabetes and not know for years. There's lots of folks in that situation. But with type 1, it was a pretty steep decline in his overall health. It was just like an unquenchable thirst. And so since he was 17 months old, he was still in diapers. And we were first time parents. And, I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, why are the crib sheets wet in the morning? He had been taking in so much fluid, but it wasn't, again, passing to that cellular level. So he was just so thirsty, which meant he was urinating much more frequently, which meant that the crib sheets were wet in the morning. And being first time parents, we thought, well, is this when we go to the overnight diapers? I don't know,
Oh,
just trying to figure it out. But, a significant shift in the personality is another big symptom, and significant weight loss. So a lot of times, if kids are not in DKA or diabetic ketoacidosis, but parents are like really starting to notice these things, specifically like in teenagers, the doctors will ask, well, what were they wearing at the last holiday? Basically trying to figure out if they've decreased in their size or if they're losing weight, so that they can, make an informed diagnosis.
Sure. Yeah, those are good markers. And sometimes it's hard to tell. Like you said, developmental stages, you don't know if this is just kind of normal development. Sometimes kids get a little bit rounder in the tummy before they get taller. So is this just part of how it goes, or is this something more concerning? So it's really interesting to hear you talk through all of those symptoms that could be kind of dismissed as commonplace.
Yeah, and I think another, this is just a theory and a question I know in the medical community, is that we notice a significant increase in diagnosis in type 1 in young people after any viral outbreak. So if a school is shut down because of their flu, you can almost bet that there will be, 1 or 2 individuals that are recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And with COVID, that trend has remained true. There was at least a 20% increase in juveniles that have been diagnosed with type 1 in the wake of COVID. And so the theory is that ultimately this, any kind of virus could potentially unlock whatever was genetically predisposed for that diagnosis. And so, for our family, it wasn't necessarily a question of whether he would ever develop type 1 diabetes, but just when. And so, he potentially could have had some kind of a virus, and then, the diagnosis came afterwards. We'll never really know for sure or for certain, but it is something to be aware of. If those flu-like symptoms persist beyond that 10-day window, then that's a pretty good time to make sure that you're contacting your pediatrician and making sure that you understand that there could possibly be something else going on.
Absolutely. Wow. So unfortunately, in 2019, the CDC rated Oklahoma the fifth worst in the nation for diabetes-related death rate. Do you have any idea why we could be ranked so highly, and what does diabetes care look like in Oklahoma comparative to the rest of the country?
Sure. So it's definitely related to the rate of type 2 in our state. I will say, the Southern eating cuisine can significantly increase your chances of developing type 2. We love butter. Who doesn't? We love, lots of red meat, but all of these things we know do increase your chances of developing type 2 diabetes. And so, the things that I'm continuing to elevate, and the concerns that I have in relation to our growing number of folks with type 2 diabetes is just making sure that they have good education and access to therapy. So when I'm talking about therapy, I'm talking about insulin, and insulin is really, really expensive. So we've been able to pass some changes, some improvements to our laws here in Oklahoma. 2 years ago, the AARP had released some information that 1 in 5 Oklahomans had gone without needed medications in the prior year. That absolutely leads to a higher incidence of deaths if you're not maintaining your diagnosis. And again, it's education. So if people don't know that they have it, or are unwilling to change their lifestyle and their habit after their diagnosis, that absolutely leads to a higher incidence of mortality.
Sure. Yes. The access and also kind of the shift in mindset need to go hand in hand. And 1 in 5, that is incredible. So tell us a little bit more about your work in advocacy in Oklahoma for diabetes care, specifically the treatment and cost. Looking at the research, like you said, insulin is expensive. The cost of care for people with diabetes now accounts for 1 in 4 healthcare dollars spent in the US. And care for a person with diabetes now costs an average of nearly $17,000 per year, which is just unattainable for many of us. So I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing in those areas.
Yeah, so a big key to making these needed changes lies in our insurance companies. So we've been able to make some really positive headway, specifically with health choice health plans, which is something that the state has control over. And so one of the major wins or the major victories that we experienced with the Diabetes Caucus recently is that health choice is now covering the cost of a continuous glucose monitor for kids. So prevention is the best treatment. I've said this to my colleagues many times, in that, if I understand not wanting to put more mandates on insurance companies, but you can pay it now or you can pay it later, because if we don't have access to the things that we know lead for a much more fruitful life, individuals will become disabled because of amputation or loss of eyesight or other significant complications related to diabetes, which means that they won't be in the workforce. They'll probably be on disability. So those are some significant costs that we incur as taxpayers. And so for me, it makes much more sense to use those dollars wisely on prevention and making sure that people, have a monitoring system that works for them. Children, especially, if you can make sure that they have access even to a pump or to other devices that make the lifestyle work for the family, then we know that they'll be able to stay in the workforce and become much more productive citizens long term, which is, in essence, what I think the Diabetes Caucus stands for, is just trying to work together with industry partners, insurance plans, the medical field, drug manufacturers. I mean, everyone's at the table, because we know that it's going to take all of us to make significant changes that will help everyone ultimately, because if an employee is missing work because they're having complications, then the business is out those dollars and that productivity for the day. So this really, in my opinion, should touch everyone in understanding that greater dollars upfront on prevention will ultimately benefit all of us long term.
Absolutely. And I like your point about the direct relation to our economy in our state. Doing those early preventative measures can make us more productive citizens and contributors to our state. And so it's beyond, it's not just a personal issue. There's a larger impact and a larger footprint. I like that point.
Absolutely.
Just as a follow-up to that question, what are some of your future hopes for Oklahoma as a state as it relates to reducing the prevalence of diabetes and or improving diagnosis and access to care?
So one of the major goals for the Legislative Caucus this year lies in rebates reform. So you'll have to excuse some of the inside terminology, but I'll try and make it as frank and honest as possible. It's taken me 3 years to get to this level of understanding. So, and I was living this every single day as a parent of a type 1, but the way in which our healthcare system is structured right now, there are rebates involved in specific prescriptions. So insulin, for instance, the insurance company is obviously going to pay out that reimbursement rate. Now we have what are called pharmacy benefit managers. The idea, or at least how they began to exist in our healthcare system, was that they were there to basically negotiate the lowest price possible, to make sure that everything that was being put on this list or the formulary that would then be given to the insurance companies to cover was the lowest price possible. The challenges start to occur when you realize those PBMs are paid on a percentage of the list price and not at a flat fee. And so there's really kind of a conflict of interest for them to actually negotiate the lowest price to put on that formulary when they're going to be losing money potentially. And so one of the things that we've noticed, and we've been able to kind of gather research, is that as drug manufacturers have taken responsibility and they're basically owned their mistakes, or are willing to kind of come to the table and say, you know what, this is incredibly costly for the individuals. We're going to cut our price in half. So they've come to the table to negotiate in good faith. And now those prescriptions are not finding their way to the formulary because the PBMs, or the pharmacy benefit managers, have excluded them from being covered from the insurance companies. Because there are rebates involved. And, there's, again, it's a very complicated system. They've, in my opinion, created it this way so that people like you and me have a really hard time trying to figure out who we should be upset with and why we're being charged so much money. And so, suffice it to say, if I boil it all down, one of the things that we're working on is rebates reform. So those rebates were intended to bring the cost down to the consumer, but what's happening is those rebates are being paid to the insurance companies. So not only are they getting reimbursed for the cost of the drug, but they're also collecting a rebate from the PBM. And so there's, in my opinion, somewhat of a double dipping. And as a result, the consumer doesn't see any reduction or very little reduction at the counter. So what we're advocating for is that at the point of sale or at the point of purchase, the consumer receives that rebate back from the manufacturer so that it significantly reduces the cost to the consumer. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important things we could do to make sure that people do have access to those life-saving medicines, be it insulin or any other necessary medications to manage illnesses. If individuals are not able to take the medicines they need in order to keep themselves healthy, I don't have much hope for the future health of our state. So this is an absolutely imperative policy for us to pass this year.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing all that and kind of breaking it down, because I'm sure we all had a feeling that that was kind of what was going on. But it's good to kind of hear, exactly the details and exactly the way forward too, if we can get everybody to come to the table. So we really appreciate your work in that area, because I'm sure it's just head banging against the wall most of the time trying to make everybody happy.
Well, and it's just trying to find the truth. I understand that companies need to make money. I'm definitely not against, recouping cost for research and development. But, when a product's been on the market with, relatively few substantive changes for, 30 plus years, it's a really hard sell to understand that there are that many costs that the company is still incurring. So, I think it's just about knowing the information, getting an honest answer, and then holding those folks accountable.
Absolutely. Yes. So if you have a history of diabetes in your family, or even if you don't in your case, what are some preventative measures to start now within your own household? We mentioned diet, especially around the holidays, kind of following mom's advice of eating one green thing on your plate every meal. But what are some other preventative measures you can take?
I think that the biggest prevention I'm just going to speak for myself, but is limiting screen time. Making sure that you are intentional about movement and activity. And I know it's hard to disengage from the devices, but again, your kids are watching. And so you are really setting them up for a lifetime of habits based on what you're doing as the parent in the household. And so, screen-free Sundays are a good way to kind of tiptoe into that direction of just really making it a family priority to, disengage from your devices so that you can also have attentive kids. Playing board games, going for walks, going on a nature hike, making it fun. I think when, you kind of think of like, oh gosh, I got a meal plan and I got to count my calories and then I've got to make sure I'm at the gym and I'm doing all these things. That's not fulfilling, and I think it could be much more stressful. So, I just think finding joy in the little things, whether it's challenging yourself or your family members to come up with a creative recipe for that green, and trying new things out, and really just discovering, I think, the joy of living a much more healthy and fulfilling life. Again, those devices, I think, are intended to distract us from seeing what's in front of us. And so if we can disengage from the screens for a while, it really puts things back into focus of what our priorities need to be.
I love that. I love the way you just put all of that. We know that screen time is not the best for our kids or for us. But when you think about it again in a larger scope of what you could be doing if you weren't engaging in screen time, if your kids weren't engaging in screen time, and especially as it relates to your physical health. And then I also like you kind of breaking it down as not another thing on the to-do list, because especially moms, but all parents in general, our mental load is through the roof. We're looking for some relief. So finding ways to have fun with our family, that's something we all want to do. That's something we're all working toward. And that's why we're all doing what we're doing every day. So that is a great, great tip. I really appreciate that. For other parents who are advocating for a child with special needs or disability or health issues, what encouragement or advice can you leave them with today?
The reality is a lot of the folks that I serve with are very well-intentioned individuals. Most of us seek public office because we have a real calling to make a difference in our communities. So my advice to any advocate is to just get to know your representatives, get to know your senator, engage in the process. It can be overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. At the end of the day, we're all moms and dads who are concerned about the way things are going in our state. And even if we disagree on the path to whatever that outcome is, I think a lot of times we have the same goals in mind. We all want to have a much brighter future for the next generation of Oklahomans. We can argue about how to get there, but at the end of the day, I think we all need to recognize the humanity within ourselves and within our elected officials. So, just reach out via email, give them a call, just see if you can have 15 minutes of their time to connect and share your story. We are all experts at our own life story. And so the things that you bring to the conversation, the challenges that you experience, whatever setbacks or obstacles you're facing as a family are absolutely valuable in explaining what the possible solutions or changes might be. And so if your elected representatives really, really care about the challenges that you're experiencing, it will prompt them to take action. They will be able to either enact policy or have discussions with other leaders at the agency level or in the community to really start to bring about positive change. But it starts by sharing your story. And we all have to be vulnerable enough to share the good and the bad, because I tend to want to always paint a rosy picture on things, but there are definitely nights where we're up all night monitoring Sawyer's glucose levels, or the pump malfunctions and we've got to redo a site change or CGM. There are always challenges. So just being honest first and foremost with yourself, and then thinking about what could make this better, and engaging those folks. I think the great thing about serving in the state of Oklahoma is that we're all really, really active in our communities. And so we're very, very accessible elected officials. And so just take advantage of that. And, it shouldn't be a scary or intimidating process to just reach out and talk about the things that are really concerning you, because I think there are always really, really strong solutions in sharing your story.
Thank you so much for sharing that today. We really appreciate your time. For those of us joining, you can follow Senator Carri Hicks's journey and her accomplishments on Instagram. Her handle is @Hicks4, number 4, okay, or Facebook @Hicks for Senate. This has really just been so informative. And I know I speak for so many of us when I say that your servant leadership and advocacy for families in our state is astounding. I appreciate you sharing your professional work and also your personal story, and then giving us some permission to do so as well. I can't thank you enough for your time today.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's been lovely spending time with you.
We'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us, and listen in next time for Raising OKC Kids.